Hello, my name is Carl Korsnes and I'm a philosopher. Thank you to Tom Hagemann and to Michael Pierce for arranging this Representational Art Conference. A quality to TRAC, in my view, is that it has a potential to change something. Only a potential. It doesn't change anything in virtue of just meeting, but it has the potential. And crucial to that potential change, in my view, are philosophers. Although there is a notion within academia that philosophers are not supposed to come up with any solutions, it happens all the time. It's like artists who are not making art for money. And through history, philosophers have come up with theories about everything that you can imagine. And in some exceptional cases, society has listened. By inviting philosophers to a dialogue with painters in the classical tradition, TRAC makes the classical tradition a topic of philosophical interest, both among philosophers and among painters. Everyone, maybe especially outsiders, as yourself and me, benefit from knowing why they do what they do. The ignorant man will say, just paint. The reflected man will think about his purpose, the purpose of his life. Why do you paint representational? Why do you paint in a classical manner? If you start thinking about this and make up a reasoned opinion, you engage in philosophy. In my presentation, I will discuss, or my plan was to discuss what I consider to be the elephant in this room. Now the elephant has already, after Odd's presentation, been disclosed, but the elephant in the room is self-expression. Many of you might have the impression that self-expression is liberating. Well, the culture's obsession with the self and the requirement of personal expression can in fact be limiting and pressuring as well. Students at art academies, that is classical art academies, are concerned with how, after ended studies, they can express themselves. I've been talking to people here at the conference, and they are happy to learn at the classical academies, but they are, what should I do after the studies? I need to find a way and express myself. How can they get their personality into their works? In this presentation, I will not use much time on crushing down the modernist. I will have a positive focus. I will try to calm down those who are stressed about finding personal expression. You don't have to. And as a matter of fact, if you want your work to reach long-lasting relevance and admiration, I argue that you ought not to. Finding a personal expression was not a concern in the Renaissance, the way it is today, or in ancient Greece. Those time periods are characterized by a different value system than the defining value system of today's art world. The ideas that were crucial in making the Renaissance possible were to a large degree the ideas of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. His book, The Poetics, was inspirational for imitators. What he wrote about the poets counts for all kinds of imitators, people engaging in mimesis, and that is painters, sculptors, musicians, and dancers. With that in common, that they are being imitators of nature. And here's the interesting quote that the rest of the talk will be based upon. He wrote, "The poet himself ought to say very little, for it is not by virtue of what he says himself that he is an imitator." Aristotle's philosophy on the role of the imitator stands, as you can hear, in sharp contrast to the modernist aesthetics, which has self-expression as a mantra. And it is useful to analyze this alternative path of Aristotle, where the painters seek an impersonal painting. In this presentation, I will very short link this Aristotelian ideas to Nerdrum's term Kitsch. So the Aristotelian philosophy, the value system of the Renaissance, more or less equals the Kitsch philosophy. And Odd Nerdrum's Kitsch is an alternative to the values of today's aesthetics. And so most of you maybe know the values that are on art values originality. Kitsch values craftsmanship. Art relevant to the time, to the present. Kitsch timelessness. Art self-expression, which is the topic of today. Kitsch the impersonal. And you can go on. But 2 points short before we continue with Aristotle. It's to understand the Kitsch philosophy, it's important to remember that art history, according to the Kitsch philosophy, is not a movement forward. So it's not a development from Rembrandt to Picasso. That's not a development, it's a shift of ideas or of values. One value system in Rembrandt, one value system in Picasso. And second, as a value system, one work can be regarded from both perspectives. Many people are, so is this a Kitsch work or an artwork? Well, some cases are obvious, but for instance, Sick Girl by Edvard Munch, from the Kitsch perspective, it's an ultimate Kitsch piece. They see the pathos in it, the craftsmanship to make it powerful, but you can see it from an art perspective as well. To see, well, claim it is original, or to claim that this is the start of the modern cubism. There are 2 different perspectives. And this is meant to be food for thought. We live in a time when self-expression is highly regarded, and philosophy involves looking beyond these values that are made from consensus. Now, let's take a look. What is consensus of today? I have a quote from the modern artist Jackson Pollock, or 2 quotes. He said, "Painting is itself is self-discovery. Every good artist paints what he is." The second quote, "It does not matter how the paint is put on, as long as you say something." Then we have the outsider. The great Kitschmeister Andrew Wyatt said in an interview, "I don't want my personality to be in the pictures. I want the pictures to be the personality." Pollock's quote about just saying something reflect one of the prevailing modern aesthetic values, the glorification of the artist's self. Who am I? What do I think about this and this? A good artist is supposed to express his personality in the artwork and uses his art to make statements. In short, he makes the artwork personal. So first, a very short distinction. It's important to differ between the personal perspective or individual perspective and the personal voice. The individual perspective is inevitable. That's something that we all have. This is life as I see it. That was how Ayn Rand expressed what an imitator is supposed to imitate. This is life as I see it. That's inevitable. The personal voice is adding something purposefully onto that. Then I start with the first virtue of being impersonal, having an impersonal approach to your art, to the painting. An impersonal painter treats the painting itself as the product and thus the object of evaluation. So imagine that you paint a portrait and you try to make it have a likeness to what you're portraying. If you're skilled, you manage to depict some emotion. If you're really talented, you manage to make a story out of that one portrait. that it's maybe moving in one direction or some kind of story. Well, that would have had you kicked out of art academies. Unless you turned it upside down or draw something on it. In short, unless you had a statement, something personal, unless you made it personal. And this is an illustrating example of the difference between personal and impersonal painting. It's a misunderstanding to think that an impersonal painting is not emotional. You strive towards depicting emotions in the painting, but not in a personal way. Where does this notion of placing the self in the center, when practicing a skill, where does it come from? Some people, historians, say that it comes from the Romantic era, when the individual was born, some people say. However, I like to trace it further back. There is a long discussion of the nature of mimesis, representation or imitation of nature. Are you supposed to imitate what you see, or are you supposed to imitate something beyond what you see? Is it something beyond the work itself? Sometimes, back in history, it has been the depiction of something religious. And it can also be the depiction of something that is true within certain dictatorships. That's the truth. Something beyond what you see. And in this case, it's the self, the personal. On the other hand, you have what can be called Aristotelians, valuing the work itself as a craft. And when depicting emotion, it is in order to communicate the story or to make the painting have a powerful effect as possible. Fine art places the artist in the center as the object of critique. Many representational painters enter into this trap of feeling the need to say something through their works and make them personal. I call this a trap. This is important. I call this a trap because when centering on the personality of the artist, the self-expression, it happens at the expense of the craft. So if you are a representational painter, you try to develop your craft, but if you turn towards self-expression, the craft doesn't mean anything. That's not on the basis of what you are being judged. A painter who decides to express his personal voice in his work invites the audience and the critics to look at something else than the painting itself. And upon reflection, this way of drawing the attention away from the work is an effective strategy for a less skilled painter. And vice versa, if you are a skilled painter, I would claim it's a failed strategy to express your personal voice in your painting, because the mastery of your craft towards which you have strived will not be in the center of attention. Moving on to the second virtue. Storytelling flourishes when the story, not the storyteller, is in focus. The self is of little importance in a Kitsch work. It does not matter who the painter is or what he or she may think about any topic. Nerdrum has said that he started painting because he wanted to tell stories. When looking at many of the classical masterpieces of the past, they depict stories from the Bible, from the ancient myths. I think this tells us that the urge to tell stories is common for many of the classical painters. When being told a story, the quality of the experience of the listener obviously depends on the quality of the storyteller. One disturbing element when telling a story, I argue, is the inclusion of the storyteller's personal voice. Imagine that you sit around the fireplace with your fellow men and you're telling stories, telling myths to each other. You're telling and one person is telling the Norse creation myth of how the giant Ymir fell asleep, and then out of his sweat under his arm, the first man and woman grew out. And then he says, well, obviously, I don't believe that really happened. Because, you can't, a man can't grow out of your arm, blah, 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 and why a man and a woman, why not two men and something? That's a disturbing element. I would tell that person, can you shut up and continue the story? That's not a good way of telling the story. And he's not even telling the story. It's not storytelling he's doing when he's saying this. It's self-expression. And the quote I mentioned by Aristotle earlier about the poet himself ought to say very little, that's a praise of Homer. He says, Homer deserves to be commended on many grounds, but mainly because he alone among the poets knew what his role should be. So it was a problem back in those days as well, that some people wanted to express themselves. Or maybe it was just a failure, that they just didn't manage to become as impersonal as possible. And what is so interesting about his praise of Homer for being impersonal is that historians today, some people doubt whether Homer was a real person. Isn't that fantastic? They think that maybe it was several people over generations that Homer was not a real person. Then you have managed to become impersonal if people don't believe that you ever existed. And the third virtue is that impersonal paintings welcome comparison. And I argue that when they welcome comparison, they thus raise the standard. Any sensible person would not compare Warhol to Rembrandt. Why not? One reason for this, I argue, is that one of the paintings is personal, namely that of Warhol. He engages in self-expression, which means that the artwork includes expressions that depend on the artist and the artist's mind, and the inner ideas become more important. Rembrandt engages in imitation, which means that the work is independent of the painter. That's what impersonal means. Some people throw, oh, then you mean that it's commercialized, or that you have no purpose, you're just like a robot. That's not what this is about. It's about, does it depend on the maker or not? It's concrete and it can be compared. You can compare Rembrandt to Titian. Some people will argue that no product can be independent of its creator. That's true to some extent. However, that's not an argument against seeking this independence. In democracy, for instance, personal freedom is one of the values, that democracies should secure personal freedom. You can argue that personal freedom is never completely possible. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't seek for it, and the same with impersonality. And a Rembrandt painting can, as I said, be compared to Titian painting because both of them are sufficiently independent of their creator's mind.
Compared to who painting?
Titian.
Oh, okay.
Titian, yeah. They are empirical products, not based on vague metaphysical ideas. What's the virtue of this comparison? You can steal. Isn't that wonderful? Rembrandt's late paintings constitute an answer to the question, what's the virtue of comparing? Rembrandt saw some of Titian's late works. He compared them to his own works and found out, I want to use some of this. He stole. In principle, you cannot steal anything that's personal. then it's not personal anymore. And also what is personal is not as available to steal because it depends on someone that you're not. And Rembrandt improved by stealing. And this was how the practice was back in those days. And it's not, of course, something morally wrong about stealing good techniques. Another word for stealing is, in this sense, is learning. You learn from each other. That's a virtue. And learning leads towards improvement. An impersonal painter is open to learn and steal from other impersonal painters, and thus become a better and better painter and more skilled. Nerdrum has said the following about the core idea of Kitsch. It is not who you are that is important, but what you can do. Also, an impersonal work stands better on its own. It speaks for itself. For instance, a Rodin sculpture or a Mona Lisa, you don't really care who made it. You can have a fascination for the sculptor or the painter, but it doesn't really matter. But to make those kind of works are demanding and really difficult. Therefore, it's so nice to be able to steal or to learn from others. And the fourth virtue is that the impersonal painting exceeds the personal. And that's when the magic begins. And before talking directly about this virtue, it's beneficial to clarify that the impersonal in this context does not equal objective. Neither does it equal disinterest. Rather on the contrary. Just to clarify. Paintings can very well be impersonal without being objective, in the sense of being naturalistic or expressing something true. Again, it's wise to turn to Aristotle. The historian sets down what actually happens, while he says it's not the poet's function to describe what actually happens. He has to describe what can happen. That is, what's possible, or necessary, or likely. That is why poetry is more philosophical and more serious than history. Poetry describes the universal, whereas history deals with particulars. There is universality when we have to deal with likely or necessary sayings and deeds of a man of a certain stamp. End quote. The poetic painter, in the Aristotelian sense, is concerned with depicting the universal in an impersonal manner. The purpose of portraying the universal is for the picture to throw light of what is beyond the particular. So, for instance, the success of a self-portrait painted by a skilled painter is not measured alone on its likeness to the model, although it's necessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for a good portrait. Not hyperrealism, in other words. It's also judged on its ability to make the audience familiarize with it. Thus, a successful self-portrait can throw light on other individuals, and hence increase our knowledge and understanding. If you reach beyond the personal, you have managed something that is difficult. Let me use an example, a quote by my piano teacher, Tatiana Thun. She once expressed about Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, second movement. She said, "This is about peace, not personal peace between Beethoven and his neighbor. This is about world peace." End quote. In order to enter the realm of the eternal, one must exceed the personal expression. A work that depicts something that is everlastingly relevant for any human. In short, the view is broader than the personal and broader than the present. It depicts something universal. One depicts a common individuality and acknowledges what I call the pastness of the present. So this is an important word, the common individuality. Many people react when they hear universality. It's like, oh, who are you to define what is universal? It's common individuality. We are all individuals. We know what is common. An impersonal painting has the potential of making the work better than the person who made it. And the last virtue I will present is that through superficiality, the impersonal painting reaches a depth. Ayn Rand said, with an example of portraying a woman, that if you paint everything, there's no need to paint at all. She used an example of painting a beautiful woman, and if she had a mouth sore, if you painted that, it was a disgrace to humanity. And some people say that if you make those choices of not including something, then you have expressed yourself, like, I got you. Well, if everything that is a conscious decision is self-expression, then nothing is self-expression. We're not talking about that which is inevitable or that which is a conscious decision to make a certain effect upon the viewer. We're talking about personal expression as an additional voice, attempting to communicate inner life. And at first, it might seem like a conflict between Aristotle's statement of reducing the role of the self and the Kitsch tradition of painting vast amounts of self-portraits. That's not a conflict, because the inner self is of little or no importance for a Kitsch painter in action, for a painter following the Aristotelian ideas, even when he's painting a self-portrait. Nerdrum has said, a painting using the old master style is central. His aim is to become engrossed in his work and skillfully render life's eternal moments without prejudice. Here I understand prejudice to mean personal expression. After all, being personal is to have prejudice. In contrast, Immanuel Kant argues that the way to reach universality is to exclude interest. That is, interest in the object of portrayal. A painting of a nude, sensual woman, that is interesting. So we're not supposed to paint it, at least not sensually. Picasso followed this. I would consider him a prime example of self-expression. His late female portraits have a distance to the women they portray. They're stylized, not sensual. They lack interest. Somewhat paradoxically, the personal, in other words, does not mean intimate. Personal is a way of being disinterested. Think about it. The personal is per definition a statement. The inner cannot be expressed directly. It must be channeled. It must be objectified. The personal voice treats the object in question as abstractions. The personal voice is uttered through a kind of language and is therefore predisposed to use collective terms to describe the object. In other words, the impersonal is not disinterestedness. It's the opposite. The impersonal appeals to what is common to individuals, the sensual. What this means is that it does not matter who the painter is or what she or he may think about any topics. The painter's voice is not meant to be expressed. it is the study of the outer self in a self-portrait that matters. Imitation is about understanding the object of depiction, of dwelling into it. The empirical reality is there to be studied. At best, the painter can even treat the object as an intimate subject, having a relationship to it. In other words, the superficial, which in a way is a dwelling into the physical, the outer, gets depth in virtue of becoming intimate.